So let's start as we normally do with our stories. If you just want to pop into the chat your name and your age and where you're calling from today, and then we will get started. So I've got some familiar faces I can, familiar names I can hear. We've got Ella, who's age 3, and she's calling in from Leeds. Hello, Ella. It's nice to see you. Who else have we got today? So just put your names in to chat. We've got Reef from Ormskirk, and I know you've come before, Reef. It's great to see you. We've got Bo, age 6 from Birmingham, and I know, Bo, you've come before. We've got Charlie, who's 10 in Scotland. Charlie, you normally have somebody else with you. I wonder whether you're on your own today. Really great to see all of you here. I'm going to get started with our story because it's quite a long story today, and because I was a little bit late, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer, and we'll hopefully have some time to chat together at the end. Oh, so Charlie's brother's in hospital. I'm very sorry to hear that. I'm really pleased that you're here with us, Charlie. And we've got Ida, who's age 4 from Brighton. Great to see you here, Ida. Welcome. So today I'm reading your story, and I'm going to read you a story about a friend called Vole. Oh, actually, we've got a cat today who is with Bo. Bo's cat's here. So some of you might have got a cat or a brother or sister or another friend in your house. That's great. I've brought my friend Vole with me today. Charlie's got his dog, which is great. So whoever you are, whoever you've got with you, I hope you're sitting comfortably. Now, as always, you have a choice of how you want to listen to the story. You can either follow on the screen as I read, and you can read along with me, or you can close your eyes or look out the window and just imagine the story in your own head. So however you want to listen to the story, it's totally up to you. I'm now going to share my screen, and I'm going to read today's story. And today, the story is called Voles Big Flood. Okay, so I hope you're sitting comfortably, and we will begin. Vole's Big Flood. It was breakfast time, and Vole was feeling particularly hungry this morning, having had a very long sleep. He stretched his little legs and wriggled out of his nest and down into the food store burrow to enjoy a nice big pile of crispy seeds for his breakfast. However, after just a few steps down into the burrow, he heard a splish-splosh sound and realised to his surprise that his feet were wet. He blinked a few times to adjust his eyes in the dark and saw that the floor was completely flooded with water. He splashed his way over to the pile of seeds that he'd just collected the day before and discovered to his dismay that they were completely soaked. His food store had flooded. Flummoxed and frustrated, Vole wriggled his way back out into the burrow and into the bright morning sunshine, where there was not a rain cloud in sight. He looked around himself, peering at the sky and shaking his little head in confusion. As he looked up again, he saw his good friend Squirrel waving at him from a branch in a nearby tree. "Morning, Vole," called Squirrel cheerily, scuttling down the branch to join Vole on the forest floor. "My goodness, you do look glum this morning. What on earth is the matter?" Squirrel asked, peering at his friend with concern. "It's my seeds," said Vole mournfully. "They're all wet. My food store has flooded again. This is the second time it has happened now this month. I still had one pile of seeds that was soggy from last week's flood, and now my 2 new piles are completely drenched. I don't understand why this happened. It's not supposed to be raining at this time of year. This is the dry season, and it's when I normally collect all of the seeds to put safely into my underground food store, ready for winter." "Well, why don't you keep your seeds up in a tree like me?" said Squirrel helpfully. "I don't ever have flooding problems, as I carry my acorns high up in the treetops, well away from any puddles." Squirrel looked up into the branches at the acorns he'd just been munching on for his morning snack. "I can't do that, Squirrel," said Vole. "The tree is far too high up for me. Besides, I'm used to storing my food in the ground. I'm a vole, and voles don't do things the same way as squirrels." At that moment, Beaver ambled over out of the trees. Morning, Squirrel. Morning, Vole. What are you up to this morning? Asked Beaver, smiling warmly at his two friends. We're trying to help Vole solve his flooding problem, said Squirrel, whisking his tail excitedly in the air. My food store has flooded again, Beaver, exclaimed Vole glumly. It keeps happening, but I just don't know why. This is the time that it doesn't usually rain, and so it's when I normally collect lots of seeds ready for winter. Said Beaver, thinking deeply for a moment. Why don't you build a dam around the hole to your food store? That way you keep the water out whenever it rains. I can't do that, Beaver, said Vole sadly. I don't have big teeth like you, and I don't know how to build dams. I'm a vole, and voles don't do things the same way as beavers. Besides, I spoke to Dormouse about what happens when the trees fall down, and I don't think we should be chopping down any more trees in this forest. You're right, said Beaver, thinking about the lesson he learned from Dormouse about the consequences of chopping down lots of trees. Now, some of you came to that story. We read that a few weeks ago. It was called Dormouse's Wobbly Tree. We'll talk in the end to see if you remember what the consequence of chopping the trees was. The three friends stood quietly together, scratching their heads and thinking very hard about what to do. Whilst they were thinking, Hedgehog rustled his way towards them through the leaves, huffing and puffing as he snuffled his snout along the ground, searching for insects for his breakfast. Hello, mumbled Hedgehog, his nose still stuck in a pile of leaves. What are you all looking so thoughtful about this morning? My food store has flooded again, Hedgehog, explained Vole. It keeps happening, but I just don't know why. This isn't the normal time for rain. This should be the dry season, and it's when I normally collect lots of seeds and store them underground in my burrow ready for winter. Well, why don't you just eat something different instead, Vole? Suggested Hedgehog, lifting his head up for a moment from the crisp pile of leaves. I love munching on insects. They're all over the forest floor, even in the winter. And so you wouldn't have to store them anywhere, as you could just find them all over the place. And with that, he stuck his snout back in the leaves to search for more grubs. Well, thanks for the suggestion, Hedgehog, but I don't eat insects. Eating them would make me feel quite poorly. I like to eat seeds because I'm a vole. Voles don't do the same things the same way as hedgehogs. Vole wandered over to a little clearing in the trees and peered up high into the sky. I wonder why it keeps flooding in the first place, he muttered. There really shouldn't be any rain coming at this time of year. Do any of you know why my store keeps flooded when this is supposed to be the dry season? It's probably something to do with the weather, chirped Squirrel. No, it's definitely something to do with the climate, said Hedgehog confidently. Well, what's the difference between weather and climate? Asked Beaver, wrinkling his nose up in confusion. I've no idea, said Vole, but I'd like to find out, especially if it can help me to understand why my food store keeps flooding. I wonder who we could ask to help find out the difference. What about Lizard? Suggested Hedgehog. He's been living around here for a very long time and knows an awful lot of things. He's very wise, and I'm sure he will be very happy to help us. And so the animals ambled through the forest out to a clearing on the far side of the grove, where Lizard was peacefully basking in the morning sunshine on top of a very large rock. Morning, Lizard, squeaked Vole, peering up with his little eyes to the rock high above his head. We've been thinking about some big ideas and wondered if you could help us with our questions. Lizard opened one of his eyes and peered down at the collection of friends at the bottom of the rock. He moved his body so that he could keep the sun on his back while he talked to the little group. Asking questions is a great way for us to learn, said Lizard in a rather wise voice. I'd be delighted to help you think a little further. What are you puzzling over this morning? We'd like to know what the difference is between the weather and the climate, said Vole loudly. And I'd also like to know why my burrow keeps flooding when it's supposed to be the dry season right now. What interesting questions, said Lizard, opening both of his eyes and sitting up straight. Why don't you all come and join me on this rock and I'll tell you all about it. The animals scampered up, clambered, scuttled and wriggled their way up onto the rock and settled themselves in a circle around Lizard. After a long pause and a very deep breath, Lizard said loudly, "Climate is what you expect. Weather is what you get." The animals all looked at Lizard, feeling rather confused. Excuse me, Lizard, said Vole rather gently, but I'm afraid we don't know what you're talking about. Let me try again, said Lizard, giving a little cough, taking a deep breath, and then proclaiming, "Climate is the pattern of the weather that we expect across a long period of time." "You mean like a week?" chirruped Squirrel. "No, not a week," said Lizard. "A month?" said Hedgehog. "No, not a month," said Lizard. "The climate is the average weather in a particular place over a long, long time, normally over many years. The climate tells us what the weather is like at different points during the year in a particular place. Now, by watching the weather for several years in one place, we can see what the climate might be like each year in that place and use this knowledge to help us to know what conditions will be like at different times of the year." "Ah, so that's why I collect my seeds now, because now is the dry season," squeaked Vole excitedly. "That's right," nodded Lizard. "All of the different places around the world have different climates. Some places have long, dry seasons. Some have long, rainy seasons. Some places have very high temperatures and some low. Some places have long, hot periods and some places are very, very, very cold. Now, our friend Goose would be good to talk to if you want to learn more about different climates. She gets to experience lots of different climates when she migrates to different places across the world each year." After his long speech, the animals were all quiet for a very long time, whilst their brains whirled and swirled and whizzed and ticked, thinking about all of these big ideas. After quite a long time, Hedgehog piped up. "I think I now understand what the climate is, but what's the weather?" "Oh, that's much easier to understand," said Lizard, smiling wildly. "The weather is things like the wind, the rain, the sun, and the snow. It's what we experience each day and each season as the days change. For example, what's the weather right now, Hedgehog?" "It's sunny and dry," said Hedgehog, sticking his nose in the air and sniffing the warm morning breeze. "What was the weather last night, Vole?" "Well, even though I was sleeping, I know it was raining because all of my seeds got wet," said Vole sadly, remembering again his big flood. "But my big question is, why is it raining now when it's supposed to be the dry season?" Lizard paused for a very long moment. He said, "Now that's a very, very big question indeed. The truth is that climates can change over time, and there are many reasons for this to happen." "So what can we do if it changes again?" said Vole. "How can I keep my food dry if it keeps raining in the dry season?" "I suggested storing his food up in the treetops, said Squirrel. "I suggested building a dam around his burrow to keep the water out," said Beaver with a grin. "And I suggested eating insects instead," said Hedgehog proudly. "Well, these are all great ideas," said Lizard, smiling, "but they don't work for Vole. How about you all think together about something that Vole can do in the future to protect his seeds in case this happens again?" And with that, Lizard gave a little nod of his head and scuttled swiftly off the rocks, darting across the ground back into the forest. The animals slowly walked their way home, each of them thinking hard about all that they'd learned from Lizard, whilst also trying to think of ways to help Vole with his big flood problem. By the time they got back to the clearing, they were buzzing with excitement as they'd managed to come up with a plan. A As soon as they arrived, Beaver dashed off to the riverbed and soon returned dragging lots of reeds behind him. Pretty soon he was hard at work, weaving them all into a very large net. Whilst he was weaving, Hedgehog bustled off into the forest to collect a great pile of dried leaves, and Squirrel scampered up a tree to clear some space on one of the lower branches. Meanwhile, Vole was busy dashing back and forth from his burrow to the forest, carrying his pile of rather soggy seeds. After a lot of hard work, their great idea was finally ready to try out. Beaver had weaved together lots of reeds from the riverbank to make a net big enough to store all of Vole's seeds for the winter. Hedgehog had collected lots of leaves to put at the bottom of the net to create a blanket so that Vole could pile all of his seeds on top of the leaves. They then covered the seeds with more branches, and Squirrel scampered up in the tree to hoist the net up in the branches safely off the ground in case the rain came again. By working together, the animals had made Vole a seed store which would keep his food dry no matter what happened with the weather. Whilst they stood admiring their creation, Vole declared that today had been a good day after all. Not only had they all learnt to ask questions and they learnt lots of new facts, they'd also learnt how important it is to work together to help each other deal with big problems. To celebrate their hard work, the friends all brought some of their favourite food and sat down together to enjoy a very, very late breakfast. The end. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Now, there were lots of things in that story that we learnt about. We learnt about the climate, we learnt about the weather, we learnt about lots of different ideas. I'm going to ask you my first question. What's the weather like with you today? So if you haven't been outside, you can have a look out the window. You've hopefully been outside, but if not, you can peep out and tell me, what is the weather like where you are? So it's windy in Scotland. Yes, it's quite windy down here. I'm in Devon. It's a bit dull with Reef up in, with Ethan up in up north. I can't remember where you were. I think you were in Leeds. It's windy and cloudy. Oh, it's hot in Spain. Very nice. It's a bit rainy for some of us too. Now, this morning at my house, it was really sunny, and this afternoon, it's really rainy and windy. And yesterday, it was really hot, and today, it's really cold. Now, one of the things we learnt about in the story was the difference between climate and weather, and this is a big question. I'm going to just remind us of what Lizard said about this. I'm going to share my screen again and let's see what Lizard said. So Lizard said, the weather is things like the wind, the rain, the sun, the snow, and it's what we experience every day. So we've just shared the weather. So some of you have got rain, some of you have got wind. It's a bit dull with some of you have got sun if you're in Spain. But the climate is the pattern of the weather that we expect over a long period of time. For example, a dry summer or a cold winter. Now, I live in a place called Devon, which is at the very bottom of the UK, and the climate we would expect here is for the winter time to be cold and wet and a bit dark, and the summertime to be warmer and sunnier and drier. And that's the climate that we would expect here. And most of us, I think, are in the same country, so we have a similar climate. Now, Lizard said all the different places around the world have different climates. Some places have got long dry seasons, some have got long rainy seasons, some have got high temperatures, some have got low temperatures, some places have got long hot periods, and some places are very, very cold. Now, I wonder, can any of you think of somewhere in the world which has a very different climate to where you live? Now, as I said, my climate is normally warm in the summer and cold in the winter. Now we've got Brazil. That's a great answer. And those of you who were here with us last week will have met my friend Carolina, and she was reading a story from Brazil. And she was telling us that she was really, really hot. Now it's funny because at the time I had 3 pairs of socks on in England and I was really, really cold. But in Brazil, in the tropics near the Amazon rainforest, they have very long, hot dry seasons and very long wet seasons, but it doesn't get really super cold where Carolina lives in Brazil. Another great answer here, we've got the Arctic. Now, what's the weather like in the Arctic? You're absolutely right, it's a very different climate to where we live. What's the weather like in the Arctic? What do they get a lot of? Probably every single day. Something that I love, and I love playing on with my sledge. They get lots of snow and ice, brilliant, and it's freezing cold in the Arctic, absolutely freezing. Now in the story, we learned that Goose flies over many countries every year when she's migrating, and she gets to see lots of different climates. So I want you to just have a moment before we finish to go exploring with Goose and learn a little bit more about some of the climates around the world. Now, some places in the world have a tropical climate. So we were just talking about Brazil, where our friend Carolina lives. Their climate would be called a tropical climate. Some places in the world have what is called an arid climate. That's very dry. So somewhere like the Sahara Desert in Morocco, in the north of Africa, would have a very arid climate, a very dry, hot climate. Oops. Some places, like we've just said, the Arctic, would have actually what's called an Arctic climate. So the North Pole in Alaska would have an Arctic climate where we know it's very, very, very cold. It's freezing with lots of snow and ice. And some places would have what's called a temperate climate, like Puzzlewood in the UK. Now there's a bit of a clue on that slide, but I want to ask you a question. Which of those 4 climates do we have in the UK? Do we have in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, because we're all in the same climate? Which of those climates do we have in the UK? Do we have a tropical climate, an arid climate, an Arctic climate, or what's called a temperate climate? Which one of those do you think we have? Well done, that's right, it's a temperate climate. It's quite a tricky word. Now, a temperate climate means it's not too cold and it's not too hot. Now, we might say, actually, it does get really cold in winter, but compared to an Arctic climate, it's not super cold. And we might say, oh, it gets really hot in the summer, but compared to a tropical climate, it's not that cold. So actually, lots of people quite like living in the UK because we get a balance of both. But actually, wherever we live, we get very used to our climate very quickly, whether it's hot or wet or dry or cold. And we learnt at the end of the story that for some reason, and there's many reasons, our climates are starting to change. And you might have learnt about or heard about climate change and some of the things that are causing climate change. But really, the one message I want to take away from today's story is when the climate started changing in the story and there were some problems for Vole, what happened to help Vole out? What was the moral of the story that when we have big problems, what can we do with each other? When we've got big problems happening around us, what can we do? And what do the animals all do at the very end with Vole? So Vole had her own problem, and rather than leaving her alone, what did the animals do? And Vole had this problem with her flood. They were really kind, well done, and they helped. That's right. They all helped and they all worked together to come up with a solution. And that's what's happening all over the world. Countries all over the world are working together to come up with solutions to changing climates. And so we've got lots of ideas happening all over the world. Now, if any of you want to learn more about this story in changing climates, we've got a whole free program that you can download, and you can perhaps get an adult to go onto the Thoughtbox website and look up changing climate, and we've got lots of activities that you can do. But thank you, we've come to the end of our story time today. As I said, it was a bit of a long story today, so we didn't have as much time together to talk. But I really enjoyed spending time with you today. We've got another story next week from Brazil. So Carolina is going to be back again next week from a tropical climate in Brazil. so we can travel across the world again next week. But for today, I'm going to say goodbye from Devon, and thank you again, all of you, for coming along. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and I will see you all next week. See you soon.